Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Emergency Shelter Learning Series. We're going to get started in just a few seconds. Before we begin, here are some logistics to know about today's webinar. Please note that because of the large amount of attendees on the call, all lines are on mute. And please pose questions at any time in the questions box. We will try to get to as many questions as we can if there is time remaining at the end of the webinar. But because of the high volume of attendees, we may not be able to answer all of your questions. We will continue to respond frequently to questions as they're asked over the course of the series. And then last, the webinar and slides are going to be posted following this presentation, so please feel free to share with your staff and any other stakeholders. And also want to note that in the chat box, we have sent out the Emergency Shelter Learning Series webpage where you can access past webinars and other resource materials. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning of this webinar. My name is Christy Schollenberg, and I am a Senior Technical Assistant Specialist here at the National Alliance. So I'm joined today by the Director of the Center of Capacity Building, Cynthia Najendra, and we are very fortunate to have two fantastic panelists from the field, Deronda Metz, who is the Director of Social Services from the Salvation Army of Greater Charlotte, and Linda Olson, the Housing Program Coordinator for the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And they're here to share their experience and guidance from operating and working with emergency shelters. They'll tell you more about themselves shortly. We're really excited to continue the Emergency Shelter Learning Series with today's webinar. And with that, I will hand it over to Cynthia to tell you more about today's webinar and the Shelter Learning Series.
Hi, everyone. Actually, Christy, I think we have a poll before I get going. So do you mind doing that first poll?
You're right. I apologize for that. We do have a poll. So folks, you should see on the screen, I'm going to launch a poll here. And we give you the next few minutes to take this poll. So we've got people putting in their questions, and the question is, how would you describe your shelter? And we've got folks, about 51% of folks have voted. And we're up to 70%. All right. Let's try to get as close to 100% participation as we can. And we're almost at 75%. Close to 80. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close the poll. And I'm going to show the responses here. So the poll response, folks we've got 11% think that they are amazing. We're the best at what we do. And 53% of you says we're improving and transitioning your shelter. 30% said we could use more guidance on how to make that change. And 3% were struggling to operate effective shelter. And 2%, thankfully, though we hope this webinar will help you, said we are totally lost, please help. So Cynthia, I will transfer it over to you.
Thank you, Christy. Yeah, I'm glad that we have a bulk of folks who are already working on improving and transitioning their current model. And for folks who need more guidance, we always have a way to give us feedback. You can email us or let us know in the chat box here about what kind of guidance you would really like to hear more about in future webinars or tools we release. And for those of you who are struggling and feel lost, we really hope this is going to be helpful and we can continue to support you in improving your shelter practices. So thank you again for attending today's webinar. Hopefully some of you have attended some of our past webinars in this series, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can access past webinars if you haven't seen them or if you'd like other staff to see them. So why are we even talking about shelters so much lately? Well, shelters are extremely important, and almost every community has one as a response to homelessness. And sometimes it is a community's only or primary response to homelessness, and so you're doing a lot of work, wearing a lot of different hats. So shelters and other types of crisis beds are critical to the functioning of an effective crisis response system, because no matter what kind of system you have, people who have housing crises need brief and non-recurring. All shelters in a community do not need to be low barrier, but every community needs some low barrier shelters so that everyone has a place to go that needs a bed, especially if there are people who are living on the street. So you want to make sure that you at least have enough low barrier shelter as a community to help people who are not being engaged by the current shelters that you have. Next slide, please.
Cynthia, did I go past too far? Apologize.
No, actually, I'm actually just seeing the poll slide right now for some reason. I'm not seeing the next slide.
Oh.
Or maybe I just am not seeing it on my...
Oh, you're right.
We're still in the poll mode.
Oh. Yeah, 1 second. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Perfect. So if you can, just go back one more. Awesome. Thank you. So we want to acknowledge that operating an emergency shelter is really important, and as I said, critical to a system, difficult, often life-saving work. And the series we've been doing with the help of so many experts in the field is really meant to help communities and shelters already build on the really important work that you're doing to respond to homelessness and shift practices in ways that will benefit people experiencing homelessness, and to help communities to take a systems and more housing-focused approach to providing emergency shelter services. That would really sort of align with other parts of your system that are taking a housing-first approach, and emergency shelter should really be part of that. We also want to acknowledge that change is really hard, and doing things differently can be very anxiety-provoking. However, when we are talking about these things and transitioning your shelter, we're really hoping you will hear about strategies and experiences from other shelters to make your work easier, more rewarding, and ultimately improve outcomes for people who are experiencing homelessness in their communities. We've already heard from many of you, and we're really thankful for your responses and your feedback and your questions, and really excited to hear that you're making changes that are resulting in positive outcomes, even in a very short period of time. And again, please keep sharing feedback about those transitions. And through this series and associated tools and guidance that we have, we're hoping that you get started transitioning, and if you haven't already, and really feel supported in making these changes. So next slide, please. The Emergency Shelter Learning Series has a series of webinars, key elements to operating an effective shelter, which I will go over in a minute. Self-assessments, which you can download. One of them is actually already in the resources box here, as is the key elements infographic, tools that your shelter can use to make these shifts, and some guidance from other shelters that have made these shifts that hopefully will help you and support your staff through these changes. So the primary goals of the series are to help you strengthen shelter policies and services to improve the housing outcomes for people experiencing homelessness. And for the systems folks on the webinar, or people who are kind of trying to bring together a lot of stakeholders together to have a system-wide response to homelessness, this is to help you implement a systems approach to ending homelessness that includes emergency shelters, because again, they're really important. You can't really have an effective system without them. Aligning emergency shelters goals with your overall community's goals to end homelessness, and really how to provide enough low barrier, safe, and housing-focused shelter. And the webinar series is not meant to just be informative, though we hope it is, but it's also intended to help you actually take action and accomplish the different activities that we're discussing today and in past webinars during the course of the series, so that you can build on the work you're already doing and really find ways to make these changes and have us sort of be there to help support you and answer questions and sort of take on a month-by-month basis, take small changes, do it in phases, and see how it works. You can directly download the tools we have shared from the webinar resources. Here in the chat box, you can see sort of there is a resources section, or a handout section rather, and there's some tools there. But there are more tools on our website. If you click on this link, and again, this webinar will be available and posted, so this link will be available too, or you can just Google Emergency Shelter Learning Series, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and you'll find it. Here's some past webinars in the series, and you can go ahead and watch those on our website as well. And this one will be recorded and posted shortly. Throughout the series, we have been talking about how to retool shelters by aligning your shelter with these 5 key elements. And the 5 key elements really came from working with shelters across the country, hearing what shelters were doing to be more effective and get better housing outcomes for their clients and for the people that they're serving. And we kind of, even though there's so many different types of shelters and geographies and serving different populations, there are some key elements that really seem to help shelters be more effective. And the 5 key elements that we have here are to take a housing first approach, practicing safe and appropriate diversion, so to helping people stay housed if they don't need to come into homelessness, if it's safe and appropriate, ensuring that shelters provide immediate and low barrier access so that everyone has a safe and decent place to go when they're in a housing crisis. Having housing focused and rapid exit services. We will have a webinar that sort of talks a little bit more deeply about that in the future, though we will touch on that today. And we'll also talk about data to measure performance. Again, that will be a future webinar, but we really are hoping that you use your data to really understand what's happening. I know some of our panelists are going to talk about that a little bit today as well. So on today's webinar, which is going to focus on maintaining safety and having expectations and rules in a low barrier environment, we're going to discuss the following questions. Which rules, expectations, and guidelines are the right ones in a low barrier housing focused shelter? How do you continue to prioritize safety of shelter participants and staff in a low barrier environment? How can you ensure safety within shelters that serve families with children? And how can you ensure safety within shelters that serve survivors of domestic violence? And that's for shelters who serve solely survivors, but we know survivors of domestic violence are in all types of shelters. So while the guidance can apply broadly that we talk about today, our panelists are going to be particularly focusing on shelters serving families and survivors of domestic violence. We've gotten a lot of questions from shelters who are serving those populations, so we thought it would be good to kind of dive in a little bit more deeply with experts who are doing that work to answer to respond to some of your questions. And on next month's webinar, we're going to be also focusing on rules and expectations, but we're going to be talking about shelter environments that serve single adults and have large congregate settings. So we will continue this topic, but just kind of shift our focus population-wise. And I think we have a poll next.
Yes, we do have another poll, and let's hope I can do this a little more smoothly than I did last time. So our next poll is, where are you in your transformational change? So right now we're distributing the poll, and you should see it there in front of you. So if you could take a second to answer where you're at in your transformational change. We've got about 50% of folks reporting back. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. Thank you so much for that robust response. 15% are sharing that they have some clarity about and a new vision for change, and almost half of you have said that you're integrating and restructuring in response to that change. So thank you again for participating in that poll.
So it's really exciting to see where people are, mostly because we've been asking this question throughout the series and sort of showing this graph about people sort of moving through the stages of change. We know that, again, this is a very anxiety-provoking process. A lot of you have been running shelters for a long time and doing things a certain way and trying to serve people as effectively as you can. So making these changes is hard. And so we were seeing a lot more people who were answering the question who were kind of on the right end of the scale. So that's exciting. It means that it sounds like folks are really trying things and finding ways to have a new vision and restructure things and hopefully making things better for the people that you serve. So one of the most important things we have learned from many communities, large communities, big cities, smaller ones in the middle of the country, is why people avoid shelters. Because there are people out there who are staying on the street or in places not meant for human habitation, and they often are not engaging in your shelter, or they might have come to shelters before and they're not anymore. And people will often say, quote unquote, well, they just maybe want to be homeless. And we really think that it's not about people wanting to be homeless. It's about there not being services or programs that are meeting their needs. And so we're trying to figure out really how can we change things to meet the needs of people so they don't feel like they have to stay outside. And so looking at why people avoid shelters can really inform how shelters should shape their environments to better respond to the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness and are living in an unsheltered environment. And this is from a survey of unsheltered people in Seattle. And there was over 1,000 unique surveys that were completed, focus groups, so it's a pretty good sample size of people who were not engaging with shelter services. And as you can see, 28% said there are too many rules. And this is representative of a lot of other like surveys that we've seen from other communities around the country. And so if you would like to better understand how people utilize or don't use your community shelter services or other services, we really encourage you to do a survey of consumers, people who have been inside your shelters, but also people who aren't using them, to kind of get a sense for what their needs might be and the reasons they might not want to engage in shelter or other services right now. And it could really illuminate things about your programs that you're just not aware of. So we're sort of asking you to try to imagine how people who are coming into shelters are feeling and the stress related to crisis and trauma that they may likely be experiencing, and how it feels to be handed a long list of complicated and overly restrictive rules sometimes. And that's really kind of where we're trying to start with that mind frame. Think about where people are coming from when they walk into your shelter. However, and this is really important, this doesn't mean you don't have any rules. People often equate low barrier with no rules. And so I want to emphasize this very important point. Low barrier does not mean that there are no rules. We're going to spend the rest of this webinar talking about how to have an environment that's safe and decent and low barrier and that still has expectations and rules. So we want to make sure that people really kind of get that point. I know a lot of neighbors and funders and boards think, oh, low barrier means that it's just going to be crazy town, and we want to make sure that we're saying, no, we're prioritizing safety still. So which rules are the right rules to have in a low barrier environment, and how do you retool the rules? Your guidelines, your client handbooks, everything in your written materials, how do you retool them to really reflect your new mission and your new vision, but still maintain safety? So before we go into this, though, I'm just going to see what you all think about rules.
Great, so we have another poll, and I'm going to launch it now. 1 second. The question is, what is the role of rules in an emergency shelter? And I'm distributing the poll now. We have a little over half have reported back, and we'll close the poll in just a second. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thank you for participating, and I'm going to share the poll. So what is the role of rules in an emergency shelter? And 31% of you responded to maintain order. 12% said to control bad behavior. 15% shared that it's to protect the surrounding neighborhood. And the majority of you said that it's to promote, rules are to promote safety of staff and clients. And last, 20% of you stated that it's to motivate clients to comply with their case plans. So we're going to go ahead and move on. Thank you again for participating in the poll.
So I also want to point out that the reason it doesn't add up to 100% is because you can pick multiple options. So it looks like people have, for the most part, our 93% of you all think that this is, rules are really about promoting safety, and then there are some overlapping roles as well. So I want to talk a little bit here now about why we have rules. And so, as most of you have answered, and when you ask people who work in shelters, rules seem to mainly be about, or intended to be about, keeping people safe and maintaining a community environment that's comfortable, safe, decent, and equitable. However, many rules create unnecessary and often unintended barriers to getting in, to staying in shelter, and even can keep people from getting out of shelter to housing or to other positive outcomes. And what we want to do is get rid of those barriers, get rid of the rules or rewrite the rules that are actually putting up barriers for people and still maintain a safe and decent environment. So this quotation, which I found kind of really powerful, it's from a qualitative study done on families staying in shelter. And it's an example of what parents in shelter sometimes feel. A shelter with too many rules can feel punitive, it can feel institutional, and we have to ask ourselves, why would we treat people experiencing homelessness differently than anyone else? Is it because they did something wrong? Or is it because we just assume that having a lot of rules is good for everyone? Does it help staff feel safer? What if we approached the idea of rules in a totally different way and kind of reframed how we thought about them, and instead thought about what expectations the community should be setting for everyone to maintain comfort, safety, and empowerment? It might be helpful to reframe the whole notion of rules and reframe them as community expectations. This is a whole different ring to it. Feels less about compliance or about being punitive and more about the expectation of a safe and comfortable community environment. Next slide, please. Seems like a lot of animation there. This quotation is from a qualitative study. I'm sorry. This is actually from Ian DeYoung, the CEO of OrgCode, and he has a really very effective way of talking about the role of rules that I'm going to quote here. Rules should promote safety, and they should not try to change or control people or their behaviors, because people are adults, and the job of shelters is not to try and change or control behaviors. And even when you are serving a younger population, young adults or youth, I think the same is true. The job is not to really change or control people, it's to keep them safe. So once you start to separate safety from controlling or changing behaviors, you might see your rules, client handbooks, and policies very differently. So these are also words of wisdom from Ian. And I think he would be happy that I was sharing them with you. So how do you promote safety? Here are some ideas on how to do that. Focus on respect and behavior, not punishment for actions. Use a trauma-informed approach. Linda Olson will talk a little about that in just a little bit. Use restrictions and borrowing sparingly. It shouldn't be the norm. And always connect people to alternative resources as best as possible when you have to use restrictions. Know your own values and beliefs, but don't impose them on others. Accept people without judgment. Treat guest belongings respectfully. Encourage access to basic needs like hygiene with dignity. Reinforce the strengths of each person. We really want to build on people's strengths rather than kind of pointing out deficits a lot. People are coming in already from a very insecure place, and reinforcing strengths and building on those is important. Talk about housing and community integration. Be transparent in how decisions are made with guests, not about them. Circulate frequently throughout the shelter. Actively engage with guests to encourage housing and promote hope, and also kind of change the sort of way you are engaging so that it's not so much about monitoring people as engaging them and working with them. And be sensitive to the power of your position. And that's really, I think, an important one in that sometimes we don't realize quite how much of a power dynamic is happening in shelters. So are your rules trying to change or control people's behavior or truly promoting safety? You decide. Look at your rules pertaining to sobriety, searching belongings, criminal history, weapons, curfews, chores, case management, and permanent barring. These are just some of the things that we often see in shelters, guidelines, policies, procedures, rules, sometimes just the signage. So just take a look at some of those and anything else that you have and decide, really ask yourself, is this rule really about promoting safety, or are we trying to really control people, control the environment in a way that's not helpful? Another thing to think about. Do you sometimes look at your rules and wonder where some of them came from? Do you ever sort of have an incident happen with a client that freaked you out so much that you made a specific rule just to address that incident so that it would never happen again? Like maybe a man named Marvin happened to have a lighter in the bathroom because he was trying to smoke a cigarette after curfew and accidentally set the toilet paper roll on fire. And instead of telling people not to smoke or allowing people to go out to smoke at night, you banned all lighters and searched people's belongings for lighters. Well, we call those Marvin rules, and we encourage people to look at your rules and see how many Marvin rules you have that really don't make sense outside of that one incident, and get rid of those. And you're probably, if you're a newer staff person at a shelter and you're looking at the rules and thinking, why do we have that? Well, it's a good time to review that with staff and definitely get feedback from clients about whether you really need that rule. So take a look at all of your rules, guidelines, client handbooks, written materials, and all the signage in your shelter and ask yourself, and this infographic is available on our website as well as in the handout section. All signage in your shelter and ask yourself to review incidents resulting in clients being barred, recognize similar issues that could be handled in other ways, meet with staff and clients to discuss changing the rules and gathering input, review each rule for whether it helps people get out of shelter and into housing or whether it inhibits them from doing this quickly, eliminate rules that make it more difficult for people to go into housing, drop rules that don't make sense, like those Marvin rules. Rules that may remain should be directly related to safety. Post the new rules and let them take effect in 30 days or in some period of time where people have had a little bit of time to get used to them. Hold frequent meetings with staff and clients to assess how these new rules are working and let people know they can be tweaked. Things can change. You want to see how things are impacting people, and you can make changes accordingly. And you should be tracking if the number of people that you're barring decreases, which is a good sign. So this is an example from a shelter we had visited. They threw out their pages of rules and put this up instead, and this is basically the bulk of what they say. And this is really to show that new expectations can be very minimal and still convey that the community expects people to be respectful, responsible, and safe. So again, you can contact us here if you have any questions. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Christy to do another poll before we hand it over to our next panelist.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next poll is our next and I believe final poll. So I'm going to launch it now, and the question is, if you are a shelter provider, does your shelter require, and then you have a following list of particular types of rules. So take a minute to fill that out. And a little over half of you have responded, so thank you. We'll close the poll shortly. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So if you are a shelter provider, does your shelter require the following? So 11% of you said that you require sobriety or conduct drug or alcohol tests. 23% of you have criminal background checks. 4% of you require some sort of income or savings. 15% are search belongings of potential guests, and close to half of you said that you do not have any of these rules and that you are low barrier. So we are really grateful to see that. Okay, so I'm going to now hand over the webinar to Ms. Deronda Metz. Deronda?
Hello. So let me just talk a little bit about myself. And first, let me say I've enjoyed the presentation so much. And I've been doing this work for 28 years and have enjoyed just an opportunity to shift as the need shifts, as the population change, and I'm still learning. I made a note of the Marvin rules. So I am going to go to the next slide, which sort of is a description of our shelter and what we offer. So we are the Salvation Army Center of Hope in Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte's homeless system is a little different. We have a women's shelter, and then we have a men's shelter, which is 2 facilities. So our facility is a 340-bed shelter for women and children, and we also serve intact families that are veterans. One of the things we believe that we need to operate 24/7, that people don't need to be standing at the door and the shelter is closed until 9 o'clock in the morning. We also, and really shift into this, not putting people out during the daytime on the streets to do whatever, to come back in the evening. Huge belief of mine is that we screen families and individuals in, not out. So we're not looking for reasons not to let people in the shelter. So you're not standing out there and we're doing this examination saying, check, you can't come in because of this or something else. We believe in diverting families from shelter wherever possible. Now, here's something that, as we were making a shift to low barrier shelter, moving to rapid rehousing, I had to spend some time with, because we had a lot of services on site at the shelter, and actually had received a couple of awards for the shelters, for the services we have. We have a health clinic here, and we had substance abuse treatment, and there are some people that still want to get sober. We had child care, we have Head Start here, job training program. And so what I decided to do, because I always want to do what's in the best interest of the families that we serve, is I decided to keep those programs here on site, but sort of tweak them and shift it where substance abuse treatment was volunteer, because at one point it was mandatory. If you test positive for drugs, you went to treatment. A lot of people got sober, and some people did not because they were not ready for it. So it's voluntary. It used to be a 6-week program. Now it's 28 days. Our job training program that used to be 6 weeks is now 2 weeks. So we kept those services on site, and we believe in moving families out of the shelter into rapid rehousing as soon as possible using a housing first model. We're also a rapid rehousing provider. Next slide, please. So here's some history and some of the steps we took when we were shifting from a low barrier to a housing-focused model shelter. And so we started to shift about, it may have been 5 or 6 years ago. I had attended the National Alliance Conference, and I think we were in California. And I remember sitting on a panel talking about shelter, and I was sharing the panel with a young lady from Los Angeles who talked about they had one page of rules. And at that time, we had about 12 pages of rules, very, very nice booklet. We call it a handbook, photos, everything in it. And I came back to our shelter and I said, can we get all of our rules on one page? And this sort of started us, and this was sort of the beginning of our shift. But one of the things I learned is that we needed to have buy-in from all staff, in particular frontline staff. So initially I started off with just upper management staff, and we created this 2-page of rules, right, front and back. The issue with that is we didn't have the buy-in from the frontline staff. They were the ones that after 5 o'clock or on the weekends had to work with the population that we serve. And so we had a lot of resistance. So what I learned from that is every other Wednesday in the evening at 6 p.m., I sat down at a round table, literally, with our frontline staff and let them be involved in how we talk about rules in the shelter. We also expanded our program goals to systems goals because we were trying to end veteran homelessness in our community and chronic homeless. So if the shelter had rules about sobriety, et cetera, and we needed to get someone in the shelter so we could get them into a PSH program and get them off the street, we were not being a part of the solution if we had rules and barriers put up. Lesson learned, implemented in phases. Initially, I wanted to take everything on, looking at other communities, what I had learned, and try to do it here at the Center of Hope. So I had to go back and said, okay, let's start here, and we'll implement phase 1 and phase 2. Empathy. How would I want to be treated? I got our staff to really look at what we were doing and ask ourselves, are we a trauma-informed shelter? And as a leader, I always say we have to exhibit courage to take the risk because 100% of the staff will probably never be on board. One of the things that I get told a lot is that the staff person resigned because there are no rules here. And let me just say we do have rules in the shelter, and all of our rules are about safety. Ask the question, are the shelter rules and program criteria helping us to end homelessness? And if it's not, we need to take a look at that. So here's some common responses we got from staff, and I wanted to challenge our staff and beliefs and their fears. So they said homeless families, and we serve homeless individuals as well, need structure. People need structure. People need to be held accountable. Here's a question that is a very legitimate question. What about the children? Are they safe? Are they safe? So let me just say, in a recent, and one of the things I've learned too over these years of moving to a low barrier shelter, it's not a one-time occurrence, a one-time event. It is ongoing. So recently, and I would say as recent as about 2 months ago, I sat down with our staff at that round table that we have at 6 o'clock, and they had some concerns that the reason why they felt like their job was becoming more difficult, it was because of the lack of rules. So one of the things that we agreed, and I agreed, that we would take on is that parents have to keep their children with them. It is an issue of safety. So when we talk about sobriety and we talk about are the children safe, that is the one rule that we do have to enforce. Moms have to be responsible for their children. Next screen, please. So significant rule changes for us with curfews. And you still have to be in the shelter at night. You used to have to be in at 7:30 and 8:30. Now it's 11 o'clock. Chores, this was a huge shift for us because chores, if you didn't do a chore, 3 times you were out. We stopped putting people out because they were not doing the chores. What do? We actually recreated some positions and have a staff person that if some of the chores are not done, we have a paid person that's doing it. We also started incentivizing some of our single women to help us to keep the shelter clean, which is really, really good for us. One of the things that we're doing is we're doing 10-ride bus passes, some other gifts to get people to volunteer to help us with the shelter. Drinking and using other substances. There used to be an automatic discharge if you came in the shelter under the influence. I am going to go ahead and just say that we really don't do breathalyzers here at the shelter. If you're belligerent and you cannot go and lay down and, just be respectful, we'll ask you to go to detox. If you can come in and lay down, that is a rule that we became laxed on. And housing first, social work optional. So what we used to do, you had to meet with a social worker in 30 days. If you were not working with that social worker, if you decided not to, you couldn't stay in the shelter. We also, I'll go ahead and raise my hand, had the rule that if you had not saved your money, you would get an exit. If you were not looking for a job, you would get an exit. We never charge for services here, but once upon a time was real big on savings, was equivalent to you keeping your shelter bed, and shifted from that. Next screen. So housing is a new intervention from us. And I always say when we first meet with clients that we're not talking about housing with clients, we have the wrong conversations. So we shifted from the 6-month model to a 30-day or less. Are we getting everybody out of the shelter in 30 days? And the answer is no. However, we're not setting those barriers up. So there may be some systems barriers, such as the lack of affordable units, finding landlords to serve some of our population that have some more housing challenges, but we're not the barrier to that housing, whereas one time we were the barrier. And there were landlords wanting to house our persons, and we didn't feel like they deserved housing because they didn't save or they were not following rules in the shelter. And our old model was employment savings. And I'm sorry, the next screen. Our old model was employment savings and housing. You went to the emergency shelter. We did what we call transitional shelter, transitional housing, and permanent housing. And when you look at this, rules, kept people in homelessness for a year for people that could manage to stay in the shelter, because that number really was sort of small because people could not follow all the requirements that we had set up for them. Next screen. So, I just use this picture as some of the frustration that people were feeling in the shelter. Next screen. So in the new model, we do coordinated entry. You have a housing assessment. We're linking you with housing. We're linking you with mainstream resources and moving you out of the shelter as quickly as possible. So here's some of our housing outcomes. Housing placements for us increased by more than 100%. And I have to put this before our staff because really putting everything into perspective, one of the things that they will challenge me on sometimes is the shelter is not what it used to be. We used to have rules and people would act a certain way. Some of that may be true, but our housing outcomes were low. And if our job is to end homelessness, what do we care about most? Getting people to follow these rules or moving people out of homelessness and keeping our shelters operating as an emergency shelter? Our shelter stays decreased by 110 days, and 84% of the families we've placed in housing have not come back into homelessness. This is the information that, to me, at the end of the day, that's important, and that's that we're ending homelessness. So some lessons learned. The next screen. We decrease rules and high program criteria further exacerbates the problem of homelessness. And this is what I believe. I think that if we have high program criteria, that we're keeping people in homelessness for a longer period of time. Sometimes people get discouraged. Sometimes they feel hopeless. So we need to be moving people on. More transparency and data resulted in trust and increased community support and opportunities for systems change. Our Housing First social work clients that opt out of case management, it helped us with our caseloads because they were really too high. So we had all of these folks that were on our caseloads that really didn't want a case manager, and some of them didn't need it. They were working fine by themselves. Families are more resilient than what we give them credit for. And I think I said this one time before, This is not a one-time occurrence. It takes ongoing adjustments, ongoing conversations. I wouldn't say that it was easy, but one of the things that I am thankful for is that our staff, getting buy-in for our staff, we're willing to try something new. We're willing to come back to the table because we do have to change things, and we have to shift. We're learning that we don't want to go back to a shelter with a lot of rules. Moving forward, we're getting better outcomes, but we're willing to have the tough conversations. And sometimes where we started, we're having to come somewhere in the middle and compromise a little bit. To give you an example of that, one of the things that we just cannot tolerate, we can't tolerate violence in the shelter. At one point, if people calmed down, there was a fight, we would let them go back into the dorm. But we found out that for safety reasons, there are times when it comes to violence in a shelter that we do have to exit people for the safety of everyone else. So thank you, and I'll stay on if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Deronda. It's so helpful to hear your experience, and I just want to say we've learned so much from you and are really grateful for you sharing your experiences so honestly with us. And I know that there's no one better to have challenging conversations about what's happening in shelter with, so thank you. And we do have some questions for you that we will save for the end. I'm now going to turn it over to Linda Olson. She's the Housing Program Director at the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and she's going to be talking about which rules are the right rules in a shelter that serves survivors of domestic violence.
All right, thank you so much, Cynthia and Deronda. That was just amazing. I have learned so much just listening to your presentation, and we'll look forward to the next time that I can hear that and perhaps even meet you at one of the future conferences. Would love to do that. So I'm Linda Olson with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and my experience in shelter goes back close to 32 years ago when I walked into a confidential emergency DV shelter as a volunteer. And I fell in love with the work, with the survivors there, and the whole concept of how can we keep people safe, how can we support them in their journey, and just have never left in terms of my journey through different shelters, transitional housing programs, and as executive director of a couple of organizations. So just starting out in terms of rules, I must say that the state coalition that I work for is one of several that has been working on the rules issue for a number of years. We really recognize that shelters for DV survivors absolutely need to be low barrier in order to be fully responsive for those survivors who are fleeing abusive and dangerous relationships. There really isn't, when we talk about taking in and prioritizing our space for those who are at the greatest risk, there really isn't the time and space to start putting up barriers for entry or for their presence in shelter. Our DV programs really strive to provide survivor-driven, trauma-informed advocacy. Our primary funders, FIPSA and OVW, both require that services are voluntary. So we're trying to support survivors in their empowerment in terms of making choices that work best for them. When we think about the balance of need for responsiveness to those in the highest degree of danger with the awareness of trauma impacts on people in crisis, that can really be challenging. I think Deronda has just done an absolutely amazing job at talking about how working and supporting staff, working with them is an ongoing process. Because you're looking at folks who are highly, highly traumatized. You want to be responsive to them, and you need to be thoughtful about what do trauma impacts look like and how does that impact staff people. And of course, this all applies to family homeless programs. Since HUD-funded housing homeless programs really can't anymore with the latest VAWA reauthorization discriminate due to domestic sexual violence. So we are truly all in this together. So next slide. Anyway, the next slide, oh, there we go. It asks a question for every person to really think about, do our rules reflect or conflict with values? What is it we're really trying to convey here? So next slide. So when we think about our core values, is how do you want people staying in the shelter to feel? And I think Deronda's already brought this up. I think Cynthia did also. What would you want to experience if you were homeless, if you were a survivor? How do you want folks to feel? What kind of atmosphere are you trying to create? How do you hope that your staff will relate to residents? And how should residents feel about staff? And what are the behaviors that would characterize these relationships? If the relationships are thoughtful, have been built, if trust is built, we would hope that we would see that the characterization of relationships would also contribute to a greater harmony within the facility. What do you want for people while they're with you? Are you thinking about a set program? And again, I was really uplifted by the different polls where so many were thinking about what people wanted for themselves, what are their end goals? And hopefully that would be what you would want also, and how can you best help them with that? And what do you want them to get out of the program? What is it that you can do to support them in as many ways as possible? Next slide. And so when we talk about a trauma-informed approach, I think it's really important to think about safety, first of all, and that definitely is a theme here throughout this particular presentation. And that safety includes physical and emotional safety, and it also includes the awareness of potential triggers. I think as we consider and weigh safety issues, we need to remember again that the people coming to us, whether there's domestic violence in their background, sexual violence or not, homelessness is a pretty traumatic experience. And we've even had a study done that indicates that for many, homelessness is even a greater trauma, PTSD factor than violence is. So I think being aware of all of the potential triggers that people experience when they're coming to you, and when you've got a communal living space and people living in closed spaces who are in crisis, you can already see that just the environment could certainly contribute to some of those triggers. So maybe hitting for the next little point for a trauma-informed approach, which is trust. And I often talk about staff people, advocates in shelters as just being people who walk on water. Because the relationship that each person develops, each resident develops with that provider is so key. And in order to really be able to connect, to engage, to work with somebody, you've got to establish that trust. So there's the transparency, clarity, consistency, so that as you're speaking from one staff person to another, from one day to another, there are consistent messages provided. They're clear, the transparency and how they are arrived at, what's happening with them are all very evident, and that there are healthy boundaries in terms of the relationships. There isn't the one staff person who has favorites. You know, we've certainly at least I've experienced back in my past where there were always some residents that were so much easier than others for staff people to get along with and do things for, but trying to be really healthy about how do you develop those relationships, how do you maintain the boundaries, how do you continue to have an attitude and approach that respects diversity and really embodies equity. And then along the way, the third panel is just choice. As we think again about trauma, and one of the things that have happened to our survivors, and there's another panel there, again, that says choice. we talk about rebuilding control because ultimately, when we think of trauma and we think of domestic violence, sexual violence, and homelessness, this takes away somebody's sense of control over their future, over their daily activities. They don't feel like they have control over what they're doing. So the idea that staff can support that choice, can help them rebuild control over themselves, their families, their environment, and their future is really critical. Next slide. Collaboration. And you know, this is a really difficult one for staff. It takes a lot of work, and Deronda, you just named it so well as far as it's a work in progress. We need to really support staff as they try and avoid hierarchy. I loved it with Andy Zhang's his approaches of being sensitive to power of position. While advocates or while case managers in shelter might not feel like they have a lot of power, for the people who are there, they certainly feel that. I mean, you have the power of this person's housing right now at your fingertips. So it's such a sensitive move to be able to share power and act as partners and collaborate, you know, instead of doing a directive sort of case plan, just really working with that individual to find out what do you want to do, what are your options, what are your choices, and realizing it takes a while, it takes trust before you really get a sense of who they are and where they want to go. And you know, that's when there can be just some wonderful movement in terms of a positive direction for that family. Which leads to empowerment, or the last block here, where we're thinking about being strengths-based and building on skills, not just doing things for people, but really building on the skills and the wonderful strengths that they've already shown in terms of surviving to this point. With all of this, in terms of being trauma-informed, organizational management really needs to create a trauma-informed culture so that there is sensitivity and support for staff members that have experienced trauma in their past. Just the reminder, certainly in our field, in the domestic violence, sexual violence field, there are many survivors who, in the course of healing, as they move on with their lives, really want to go into this field themselves. And so we certainly have the potential for triggers for them. Sometimes it's really hard to be working in all of these lovely, wonderful ways of sharing power and building on skills if a staff person doesn't feel respected by the client, if there are challenges, if there's anger, if those trauma symptoms ooze out and then kind of trigger some of the issues that the staff person might have in terms of their autonomy and their control and how they're working with somebody. So it's so critical for supervisory staff to be thoughtful, supportive, and aware of that, and just provide the spaces for somebody to rest, rejuvenate, and maybe at times even pass on case management or advocacy work to a coworker. So next slide. The next slide is what, over the course of the years, the state coalition here in Washington recommends in terms of thinking about rules. And one is that it should positively reflect your agency's mission and values, that the rules, guidelines, program policies should make a distinction between behaviors that facilitate communal living and behaviors that threaten a resident's ability to stay at shelter. And I think this is just a critical distinction, that if we're talking about rules or policies that is just trying to help everybody get along better and have a more clean environment, a cleaner environment, that is very different from a behavior that would say you can no longer be in this facility. So that distinction needs to happen. We should strive to focus focus on advocacy versus rule enforcement. One of the things I found out early on in terms of my shelter work when I was a shelter director was noticing that advocates were often spending much more time enforcing rules and trying to facilitate conflict than they were on doing the actual advocacy, the actual supportive work with a survivor. And it was, you know, it wasn't a great job for them. They didn't necessarily enjoy that. So being able to move that and shift that focus to what are you really here for, and that's supporting someone in their next steps. And of course, and Ian DeJong mentioned this in his list, is we control the environment. You know, that's our responsibility, is looking at the environment. We're not there to control the residents or even change their behavior necessarily, but trying to figure out what can we do to create an environment that is respectful, provides privacy and space. So next slide. I've got, at the request of Cynthia, she wanted a sample of really minimal rules, so I fished this little set out from one of our programs, a very small rural program. And you know, these can vary, but these are pretty much the rules that they've developed that would say someone would be asked to leave if any of these rules were violated. And potentially, I know there might be some work, there might be some challenges if one of these things happened. And of course, WSCADV, we continue to modify some of these approaches. But the first one, of course, also agrees with Deronda, and that's that any violence or abusive behavior will not be tolerated. It just is too difficult to have that, again, in a very close communal living shelter environment where many people have experienced violence or abusive behaviors. And of course, we know that trauma, of course, can result at times in people's behaviors toward others in a protective fashion. So while we say it won't be tolerated, there's that measure of what's happening. How can we moderate this? Is there a way for this person, maybe instead of communal living, to find another shelter option? Could there be a hotel voucher? Could there be something else that one or the other of a pair of people, a couple, if violence and conflict just seem to be there, if there's any one person who is really having a hard time with that. Shelters are weapon-free zones, and I think that's pretty much uniformly acknowledged and observed with offers as people come in. If they do have a weapon, if they do have a gun or other sort of protection, that there's an offer to lock that up, or, you know, just to kind of keep it out of the hands and out of the general population, or ask the resident perhaps not to bring it with them. So same thing, no use or possession of drugs and alcohol on shelter premises. We try to be very strict about certainly the possession of illegal drugs, and in shelter, both legal drugs and alcohol, we're careful about, again, just for the safety sake of other residents as well as children. We do ask for many of our programs that the residents don't reveal the shelter location. This is something a lot of programs are actually moving away from in terms of the idea of that strictly confidential shelter. There's the thought that it's difficult in rural areas to really keep a location totally confidential from the general public. And for any shelter that's been there for a long time, there's the acknowledgement that just keeping a shelter, keeping the facilities secure in terms of safety measures is much better than trying to keep children or residents or other people from disclosing that shelter location. No visitors. Again, that's kind of the safety for everybody in the sense of we can't reveal the identities of other shelter residents. That's the one thing that we really are obliged to be quite secure about, so that there is privacy and confidentiality. So that's the primary reason in that communal living shelter, congregate shelter, that no visitors, so that there isn't that time and place for them to realize who else might be there. And then no stealing or theft. We really hope that people will not steal, and try to provide opportunities for them to ask for what they need and give permission that they can do that. Next. So since we really recognize that a lot of the issues with rules actually stem from the physical structure of shelter, several years ago, a former coworker of mine, Margaret Hobart, worked with Malem Architects and put together a website called Building Dignity. And it's physical fixes that can help minimize rules for those of you that have communal living facilities. I'd encourage you to go to this website and check out the different suggestions that she and this architectural firm put together. And it's organized in a way that for every one of the tabs, whether it's communal space, kitchen, private space, or staff space, there's that awareness of empowerment, of secure, of reconnecting, parenting, and harmonizing. So I think it's a fun web page to kind of work your way through and think about what can you do with your physical structure that could support survivors, support your residents positively and privately as much as possible. So next. I think finally what we've done here in Washington State is try to move to a housing first approach as much as possible. Many of our organizations are implementing this. Many others are working on it, exploring it, but just really realizing that if we stop assuming that everybody needs to come into emergency shelter, and unfortunately a lot of survivors feel that the only way they can get services is to come to emergency shelter, and they might not necessarily really need that or even want that. So we try and use this approach of DV housing first in a way that survivors could avoid shelter, prevent that shelter stay, and help them stay safely and stably in their current home without the abusive partner often, and try and help them do that with advocacy, flexible financial assistance, and safety measures. Many of them just ask for safety measures related to their home. We also try to help them move on as they choose and as housing options allow. It's not like any of them necessarily want to be in an emergency shelter for a lengthy period of time, but a number of them are really constrained because of safety issues from the abusive partner or ex-partner, legal issues related to child custody and what they need to do in order to keep their children safe for the time being. We often hear from other entities like Child Protective Services that feel the children are in danger if they're not with their parent in a shelter. So there's that sensitivity to what are the external factors as far as safety, as well as what is the survivor choice in terms of moving on. But we have been very successful at getting survivors onto their own additional living options in a pretty quick way. And in our DV Housing First pilot project found that about half of over 600 survivor household units coming into this program really wanted to stay in their own home. So that was exciting to be able to utilize a housing first approach in a way that helped them do that. So I think that's pretty much all that I had to say for now, and I imagine there might be questions later. Oh, and I'll just go ahead since there's the final contact. There's our website, the State Coalition website at the bottom of the contact sheet, And we've got more information about DV Housing First. If you go to that website and look at the About Us and the projects page, you can see Domestic Violence Housing First, and you can also scroll down and see a shelter support tab that has a lot of model protocols and a lot of great information on shelters. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was fabulous, and I learned so much every time I hear you speak, and really both of you have learned a lot from both of these presentations. I wanted to put a plug in again. Linda Olson's actually a technical assistance provider for a new TA consortium that works with the intersection of domestic violence and homelessness called the National Association for Safe Housing. And they have a great new website where you can contact them for technical assistance. You can download lots and lots of resources that might be helpful to anyone who's serving survivors of domestic violence. And I'm trying to remember the name of the website, Linda. Is it Safe Partnership?
I believe it is, or Safe Housing Partnerships.
That's it, safehousingpartnership.org. We will, I'm sorry, I should have put that on a slide, but safehousingpartnership.org. I think if you just Google that, you can get to the National Association of Safe Housing and the TA Consortium, and Linda provides so much guidance to us and at the Alliance, as well as to the National Association for Safe Housing, and we are just really grateful to have her guidance. So thank you so much, Linda, and as well as Deronda. And we have some questions next. So we have about 20 minutes left on the panel, and we have a lot of questions that have come to the chat box, which you can feel free to keep doing. We also have some questions that I wanted to make sure we asked that have come up in previous webinars. So we have these questions that have come up from attendees of previous webinars, as well as in a survey that we sent out to all of you in the audience, asking what your challenges were and what questions you had. So there are some common ones that I wanted to ask our panel before we get to the ones that are in the chat box. So here are some of the challenges, just in a word cloud, that came from a survey in which we got about 122 responses, asking what was, as a shelter provider, your biggest challenge when it comes to providing low barrier shelter. As you can see, all kinds of things come up, but low barrier shelter, staff, housing, families, I think the word criminal comes up in drug and alcohol. So a lot of common challenges there. So here's a question that we've gotten, and I think it reflects a lot of questions that a lot of people have asked. How do we help people who are trying to stay sober while allowing people who are using into the same space? We're keeping people sober and we don't want to jeopardize their sobriety, so how can we serve people with different needs? And how do we keep people, how do we keep children safe when some people are intoxicated, especially if we serve families in a congregate setting? So I have a couple of thoughts, and I wanted to just ask Linda if you have any responses to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just in terms of my experience with domestic violence shelters, and certainly many survivors, one of their trauma symptoms do tend to be related to substance abuse. And of course, there are many who do want a clean and sober environment. And while perhaps being in an emergency shelter for DV survivors that is low barrier, that might be difficult. There is the ability, I think, for staff to support people working on their sobriety, around relapse prevention, around their own work with whether it's 12-step programs, other programs, so that they can focus on the fact that their environment they can't be dependent upon their environment for their sobriety. And of course, all the while working with those folks who do come back and have been using, in terms of what are their next steps. Certainly if they're using and they're children, see if they can go to their rooms, go to their space, be in a place that is safe for themselves and kids. And also remember to give just the information and options of what ongoing use can impact once they're sober, awake, they've slept off whatever they're doing. What are the options? What are the things that can hurt their parenting? What are the things that might jeopardize their safety? And how can you as that staff person work with them in terms of their sobriety, and what are the resources in the community?
Thank you, Linda. Deronda, do you have any thoughts that you wanted to share?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. You can. Cynthia?
Yes.
Okay. So that is a huge question for us, in particular because we do have substance abuse treatment here at the shelter. So what we did, and all of it is really about a space issue, if you can do it. So we for our women that are in recovery, that are in a treatment program, we put them all in a separate dorm. Separate dorm, meaning it's about 18 beds in that dorm, just for those women that are in treatment. We do have other people in the shelter that are drinking, but for those 18, we have those beds together, just sort of promoting that therapeutic environment for them. For us, it works. You know, a lot of my fears and a lot of the staff fears about what could happen, in actuality, a lot of it does not happen. Or the other reality of it is, and I say this to our staff, we've always had people that came in the shelter and drank. I mean, we may have exited the ones that we caught, but, you know, it really was sort of always an existent issue. But for us, it's sort of putting that group of people together so they can support each other. And we do have people in the shelter that are staying sober. We do have others that, you know, we're doing harm reduction with, and some that are just not ready. But that has not really presented as big of a problem for us as the staff that brought it to my attention thought that it may. As far as the children, because we have 180 children in our emergency shelter when it comes to people drinking. And I think I talked about this one time about our moms are responsible to have their children with them. We've been very fortunate not to have a lot of the what ifs. Not to say that we would only put in safety precautions if something happened. Going back to that reality, a lot of things that we project or a lot of our fears have not really been a reality for us. So protecting our children is very important to us. Moms have to watch their children. Our staff are trained. The Salvation Army, we do what we call safe from harm. So, you know, so far we've been have not had any incidents with someone with even mental illness, because we serve a population of people that have severe mental illness in an incident with a child. So we hadn't really had a problem.
Yeah, thank you, Deronda. Both of you have just said so much that I think is so valuable and powerful. And I think one thing that you said, Linda, amongst many things you said that were really helpful, is that, you know, having this question is saying, you know, we are keeping people sober, the shelter's keeping people sober, and you pointed out that people can't be dependent on their environment to stay sober. And I think anyone who's worked in recovery, I worked in a recovery program at some point, or who is in recovery or knows people in recovery, knows that, you know, it's not the environment. Yes, it can be helpful to keeping people safe and creating an environment that helps people, but they are choosing to stay sober. And I think I've had shelter staff say to me when especially when you have sometimes clients who are saying, well, I can't be in the shelter when other people are using, you know, and obviously we don't want them using on site or anything, but they're not sober. You know, that shelter providers have said, well, you know, they work with that person who's trying to stay sober to strengthen their recovery, rather than penalizing the person who's not in recovery. And also, you know, trying to sort of say, well, this is why we also need to get you into permanent housing or an environment that you have more control over, because it's really about, you can't sort of make people stay sober. And I think it's important to make that distinction. And I think also, Gerardo, you were saying that, you know, that we kind of tend to project our fears sometimes onto people, that bad things are going to happen, and that there are ways to do harm reduction that, you know, I've heard this from many shelter providers, where that, you know, the terrible incidents that we think we want to be prepared for them, but they don't happen. And I think it's, or they probably won't happen, or you don't see them happening. And I think supporting your staff and clients in this environment too, to kind of understand these changes is important. So thanks very much for answering that really difficult question. It's a question that we get a lot. So I think we'll move on to another question. So one of our biggest challenges, someone asked, is having adequate staff and balancing low barrier shelter with keeping individuals focused on housing and staying quote unquote motivated. How do we keep people staying accountable? Linda, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit the motivated thing is one of my pet peeves. When we think about, again, the work with folks, and just backtrack to the respect for people and their choices and their autonomy, and if there is adequate space provided for them to identify what are the things they really want to do, where do they want to go, and if there's that flexibility. That motivation thing, I think, takes care of itself when folks have a goal, when they have hope. You know, how can we support that hope? How can we advocate for that? And if we're advocating alongside of somebody as they reach for the hope and for the goal, that also helps people in terms of accountability, because they know that somebody believes in them. And that's what we've heard time and time again is some of the greatest success stories from survivors are people believed in us. The advocates told us that they knew we could do this. And they did. They just were really able to work hard and get to where they needed to. And if they stumbled a little bit along the way, they realized that life does happen. Trauma impacts, triggers, safety issues, and that abusive, sabotaging partner can come back into your life. But ultimately, that advocate can really, in that belief and providing that hope, help people stay accountable.
And thank you, Linda. I so enjoyed listening to you speak about the motivation. That's something that we hear a lot. And the reality of it is that we are doing more housing now than we've ever done, because we're moving people out into housing first. We're offering people hope. One of the things that I recognize is because we're having conversations with people about housing is that we're seeing more people move to employment, which is not a requirement, but we're seeing more people because there is something to look forward to, whereas we were saying you had to, become housing ready before you leave the shelter. And it didn't offer a lot of people a lot of hope who really needed to be in their own housing. So we've really received better outcomes and increased motivation by offering the housing first.
Thank you both. I really don't have anything to add. I think motivation is a word we hear a lot too, and we try to help people kind of reframe how they think about it, and you have just articulated that so well. I'm going to move on to another question. So yeah, next slide, please. Thanks. How do we make these changes and serve higher barrier people with no extra resources? I know you both know quite a bit about that.
So I can just, just go ahead and speak to that. And that would be our greatest challenge. Let me just go ahead and start off by saying that. However, one of the things that we did do is that we really literally had to get an additional staff person. I just did a restructuring in our program, because what I recognized that we needed more persons that could be trained to talk about housing. So we restructured some positions to be able to have those conversations better. So that component was our greatest strategy, but how we did get more is through doing some restructuring, changing some positions. And just as we look at our rules, look at the functions that our staff were doing. For some, it may have been sitting at the desk and monitoring the dorm or monitoring something. Could we do something else with that person? Our goal is to make sure that we have as many people possible on deck to be able to move people out and to be able to get people into housing. So being inclusive, the more people that we can have in our shelter operations trained to do that function, the better off we all are.
Linda, do you have thoughts on that? Thank you, Deronda.
Yeah, I totally agree with Deronda, and I think it is a little difficult with no extra resources, because in addition to the staff restructuring and making sure there are enough people on board, I think there needs to be the investment in staff. You know, often these are low-paid positions, and we really need to be mindful about living wages and how can we let people know that they're valued, not only with salaries, but with the benefits and the respect that goes with that, as well as just the acknowledgement that this can be really challenging work, and we want to retain staff. So turnover can be expensive when we're training new staff, when they move on to other things. So the more we can do to retain, invest, support, I think the better off we are, and we'll probably save money in the long run on that, maybe enough to cover those higher salaries.
Yeah, I absolutely want to underscore that. I think when you see that beds are turning over faster because people are exiting to housing, that you're actually able to serve more people. And that automatically kind of frees up resources. I've also heard from a lot of folks that, you know, there are resources in their budget. We've looked at budgets that say, you know, however much you were spending on drug and alcohol testing, well, that's the money you can use for housing-focused resources, or resources that you were using for your staff that were doing a lot more about things around compliance and, you know, having to do a lot more monitoring and maybe giving classes like budgeting and things, life skills that were maybe not necessary to people finding housing and maybe more helpful after they found housing, kind of freed up some resources that they already had. So they kind of could reconfigure the way they looked at things too. So I have some questions from the chat box, and I'm going to ask our panelists if that's okay in the last few minutes. So I think, so I think we have a little background feedback. I'm not sure where that's coming from. I just wanted to, okay, that might, thank you. So the idea of, so here's a question. The person asked, the idea of trial and error in regards to changing rules is great in theory, but the population served is skilled at taking advantage of certain situations. What is the safest way to implement new rules? Linda, do you have any thoughts on that?
You know, that's quite a question, and I really appreciate it. You know, we speak often just in terms of some of the trauma symptoms and talk about how people cope, how people are able to survive, and they don't always use the best coping mechanisms and survival mechanisms as far as, you know, being able to manipulate and being able to take advantage of circumstances. So I think just putting it out there and being realistic about that, and going back to the transparency of this is something we're trying to do, and we're trying to work with each person in a more respectful, thoughtful way, and trying to be careful about where some of the authority and control might come into asking people to be respectful of a different rule or a changed rule, or maybe eliminating a rule and asking folks to still be thoughtful about the environment and how not having that rule as that big iron fist over somebody's head. How can we do that and do it in a way that doesn't end up sabotaging ourselves?
Thank you. I have a question here for Deronda, and this is about your data, and I know you love data, and we are going to do a webinar that focuses a lot more on data. Someone asked sort of how you were able to show that 80-something% of folks did not return to homelessness, and the person was asking how you tracked that and for how long you tracked that, and basically how that works.
So all of those are good questions. So it is tracked through our HMIS system. But let me just say this, we are being challenged on tracking return to homelessness data. So that is saying that those persons didn't show back up to our homeless services system. And it's tracked for 1 year. So the other is, you know, we have a funder now that wants us to track that people are maintaining in their homes. So that is something that's new for us. Right now, we're pretty much aligned in HUD's goal that people aren't returning to shelter. And Charlotte, you know, those are our goals. We do now have a funder that really, and it's a huge funder for us. We got a huge endowment here in Charlotte, a $20 million endowment to do rapid rehousing that want us to track that people are still in their units. So that is taking a little bit more strategy and a little bit more work, and that's after a year out. So as well, so that's the time period, and that's how it's tracked.
Thank you. And I want to point out that in our handout section, we do have the shelter metrics that we encourage shelters to use. So you can take a look at those to see what data we think would be helpful for you to track to sort of see, to evaluate the outcomes of your shelter in a housing-focused way. I think we have time for one more question. And it's asking about whether it would be easier to have lower barrier shelter if men and women were in completely separate buildings. I'm not sure who would like to tackle that one.
Well, I can do it.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda.
Yeah, sure. We have we're predominantly a women's shelter. We do have a veterans transitional housing program and have men in our shelter. And it's interesting because that has not been one of our challenges. Like that has, the children, our staff have challenged us on that one, but not really having men. That has not really been a factor in any of our work around making the shelter a low barrier environment.
Well, I think that's
so. I guess maybe it depends.
I think that's very telling.
Yeah. So yeah, it hadn't been a factor for us, but that's not to say that it could not be, a challenge for some shelters having men and women in the same facility. But I don't have any experience with that being a challenge.
Yeah. This is Linda on our side. We have a requirement to serve everyone who's a survivor, regardless of gender. So when we look at serving men, we often think about, again, the proximity of communal living shelter. Is it private enough? Is there enough space? Is it better to try and serve men in a separate location with the same level of services? And some programs are able to serve men under some roof, depending upon, just the structure of the program, and others feel that they really need to do it separately. But it's more about the facility's environment and how it's structured than necessarily those dynamics.
So I also wanted to just mention that I think if folks out there are thinking about how to divide or separate populations, that you really want to make sure that you're compliant with HUD's equal access rule, and you can find information about that rule. There's some great access on the HUD Exchange website. We will be doing a webinar just on the equal access rule in a couple of months, so you might want to just consult that to see what really is okay in terms of how you set up your physical shelter and how you set policies around populations. So I could keep talking to you both for so much longer, but we are at time. And so I want to just say thank you so much. The questions that came in the chat box, we do keep track of those, and we look at those, and we will try to respond to them in either future webinars. If you don't feel like your question was answered, please just email us at thecenter@neh.org. Our next webinar will be in October. We don't quite have the date yet, but it'll probably be in about this time next month. It will be about which are the right rules for shelters that serve single adults. And we'll cover some of this and really kind of hear from some shelters that are working with single adults and with big congregate shelters, and also just are dealing with challenges like mental health issues and drug and alcohol issues, and how kind of to best respond to the people, the needs of people who are being served in those environments. So I want to just say thank you so much to Dorana and Linda. We're so lucky to have your guidance and your partnership, and thank you for the work that you do. Please feel free to contact us at the center at neh.org, and I'm sure Dorana and Linda, I'm sure you're available for questions as well. So thank you everyone for attending the webinar, and we will see you next month.
Thanks.